Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Kevin Gates, who is a professional staff member with the Senate Armed Services Committee since March of 2022, with a portfolio that includes the Department of Defense S&T programs and acquisition policy. Kevin is also the president of the Information Professionals Association. Kevin Gates, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thanks. I appreciate being asked. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So I'm glad to get the chance to talk with you and talk with the members of IPA and the other listeners out there.
Yeah, for sure. And it's great to have you on. And just a quick disclaimer for our audience, but what we're going to be talking about here, these are Kevin's personal observations, and they do not represent the official opinions of the Senate, Armed Service Committee, or the U.S. government. So the conversation that I'd like to have with you today, Kevin, will cover IPA's recent announcement that we are searching for your replacement, a new president for IPA. But before we get into this, the typical question that I ask all guests is if they can give just a real quick recap of the way they see our current strategic landscape, or if you like, the times in which we live.
Thanks for that, John. I mean, I from my perspective, just thinking about this issue of information and information competition, I'm a little schizophrenic about our prospects. I mean, in one respect, there are a lot of advances going on in the technology space that really give me hope. Tools for AI and machine learning and augmented reality and data visualization. These are all going to be hugely critical to us being able to navigate in the information environment much better than we do. But having also been in the space for a long time, the tools get better, but we don't necessarily get better at the actions, whether that be U.S. government or, to be honest, even in the commercial sector. It's our policies and processes, and sometimes our organizations hamper us much more. So we have the technology in a lot of cases, but we don't use it to its full advantage. And so I feel like that hampers us a lot in terms of trying to make progress, because there are some core systemic issues that we really don't seem to be grasping. And if we look back at the last 20 years, the erosion of trust in our institutions, if you think about sort of the wildly varying responses to COVID, the issues with our recent elections and information and potential interference with our elections over the past two cycles, it doesn't give me a ton of hope, because I see that we are being much more easily divided and conquered as an audience. And it's this sort of disaggregation or breaking things into smaller groups that makes those groups easier to ignore and marginalize. And I think as a society, I don't think we really realize the consequences of that erosion over time. But that's the type of thing that I hope that IPA will be able to put a spotlight on. And none of these things get fixed overnight. So I think the things like Cognitive Crucible, these discussions and the discussions that we have as a community, I think are hugely helpful in trying to put a spotlight on that and to try to find solutions.
Yeah. You said a lot there. Something that stood out to me closer to the beginning of your response was the erosion of trust in our institutions, and I really do think that that is. I mean, it's hard to prioritize these things, but that to me stands out as being like a big red blinking light. And we actually had two episodes that discuss those kinds of dynamics. I'd like to point our listeners to an episode that we had with Yuval Levin, who talks about the Constitution and institutions, and also Jonathan Rausch, who wrote a really interesting book which goes to the heart of these issues as well. And those links will be in the show notes. So as I mentioned at the top, IPA is, so this is coming out in late September, and for the next couple of weeks, IPA is soliciting nominations, applications to for a new president to replace you, Kevin. So why is now an appropriate time for IPA to be looking for a new president?
So, for one thing, I've been president now for almost 5 years. I think, I know from the start I was not elected to be president for life, and we have made, I think, a lot of successful decisions. We've had a lot of good growth, and that combination of reaching a good growth curve in membership, and then also stability as an institution. When I first came on board with IPA, we were much smaller than we are now, much more. We were doing things in a more of a craftsman way, and I think the fact that we have a lot more membership, so we have to be more responsive to members, but also the fact that as an institution, we have repeatable processes now that we didn't have when I first came on board. And I see that as a good opportunity to sort of turn things over now, and hand the baton off to somebody who can maintain that momentum. Because I think, like a lot of people, if you stay in one place too long, you stagnate. And I don't, I'd much rather be in a position of leaving this on my own terms rather than jumping the shark and being asked to leave. And so, a lot of the combination of these factors, I just think it's a good opportunity to build off of what we've done so far and hand it over to someone who has fresh blood, fresh ideas, and the energy and wasta to be able to take these things further than we have so far.
Right. Yeah, I certainly agree with all of that. Another way that I have looked at this is so like businesses go through phases, right? And the Information Professionals Association is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and it's a small business. And so I think of us as kind of like at the tail edge of like the startup phase, maybe. And as businesses go through different stages, a different kind of leader with different skill sets and capabilities is appropriate at different growth stages. Would you say that resonates?
I think that's much more eloquently put than the way I just mentioned it, but I think that's exactly right. And I do think that we are at a point in where we can scale up, where we need a different type of leader. And I hope I understand my own shortcomings. Even I can recognize that we need a different type of person to take us forward that way, just in the way that you described. And I don't think that there's anything sort of unnatural about that. It is just a matter of growth, and that should point to sort of good dynamics within the organization, that we are at that point that we need something new.
Right. And to our audience, we'll have a link in the notes, the podcast notes, for whatever app you're listening to this on, and you can hit that link and find out more information about how to share this with your network, or if you're interested in applying yourself to be considered president, information on how to do that as well. So, Kevin, as you reflect on your time as the president of the Information Professionals Association, what are some of the accomplishments that stand out?
So as I mentioned before, I think the most important one is this growth that we've seen, and that's really a function of uh, one is Cognitive Crucible, right? Drawing attention and building a community, and I think that has attracted people in a way that would not have been possible with sort of some of the traditional things that an industry association would do. I think the other big accomplishment for IPA is resurrecting Phoenix Challenge and taking that from a one-off event to a series of events to kind of keep that momentum and the energy of individuals to contribute to this going kind of throughout the year. The other thing that I'm personally proud of is what I was talking about with institutional stability, right? Like trying to build some of those things so that we have repeatable processes, because that's the hardest thing to do in a startup, is to sort of build that culture off from the beginning. Otherwise, you spend all of your time handcrafting every solution. You're flying by the seat of your pants, and that's the type of thing I don't want to turn over to a new president, or if the entire board were to change over, I want them to come in with that stability in how the organization runs, so they can focus on the content. Like what can we do for, with, and through our members in order to be more effective in this space.
Right. So do you think maybe you could talk just a little bit more about how you've perceived the way IPA has changed during your tenure, and also maybe give a sketch for some of the things that you are envisioning for IPA in the near to midterm?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of how we changed, I mean, I think we have been able to really get members much more involved. I think if I were to call what we did before as sort of IPA 1.0,
Yeah.
we were projecting things out, which I think were helpful for our members, but it was sort of a one-sided conversation. And I think that the big thing that we've tried to do over the past 3 or 4 years is make that a two-way. How do we get members more engaged to help with these things? How do we have content that we can provide them, but then also things that they can provide back, again, that contribute to this discussion, the wider discussion that needs to happen with the broader, not just the government community, but the public and other institutions. So thinking about what we can do as an organization going forward, and we've sort of set the conditions, I think, for a lot of these things. So hopefully, part of what we'll be doing as I pass the baton on to somebody is also passing on some of these ideas that hopefully they'll be able to build on. So for example, we are working on developing chapters. So really, we've been one big organization right now, but we want to get to a point where we can break that down so that regional groups can do things and come up with their own programming that helps them, that builds the community there, not just, at the central board. And so that's one, and that includes building communities of interest and affiliates that might be overseas, because we're seeing that demand from a lot of our international partners wanting to have the same conversations. But it can't, especially in that case, it can't be all on a Eastern time zone. We need to be able to decentralize some of that. I also think that the establishment of the Journal for Cognitive Security is going to be another step, right? That is, creating a more formal discussion path, right, where people can put out peer-reviewed research on topics of interest to us and really elevate sort of the academic discussion because the thing that we need to be doing more of is building that sort of full pipeline, and I want that to include sort of building the next generation of folks who will take over for us long after we've retired, because this depending on the parts of the community that we talk about, some of our tribes are pretty old, but we have the opportunity to start mentoring the people that, and they may be in different communities, that want to sort of be more active in the information operations and cognitive security space. And the multidisciplinary part too, right? Because that's the other thing, which is we want more than just information operators. We really need to branch out into a broader, whether that be commercial, so that we understand what's happening like in the marketing community and the finance community, because all of these things are connected and they're all tools in the toolbox. But we have, I will admit, we have traditionally as an organization been very focused on military and national security needs. And I want us to grow into that. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping that a new president will be able to do, which is bring their networks to bear to like help with that. It's not just growth, but expansion laterally out into other areas we haven't been involved with before.
Right. Yeah, 100% on all that. Maybe I could ask you about some discrete topics and just get your quick comment on that, as far as on these topics, either where IPA is now, or where you'd like to see IPA go relative to these various different topics. So let's start with just your thoughts about engaging with the younger generation or the next generation.
Yeah, as I was saying before, I mean, that needs to be a focus. I think we have sort of been agnostic to some degree. I mean, we have been trying to be more active in platforms that make sense, like I mean, particularly with Slack, but I think we're looking to do try to expand into sort of YouTube channels as a way to get those to get to that community. But I'll be honest, it is a cognitive block for me, right? Like I don't operate, and this is where not being a digital native hurts, because that is not necessarily natural for, I think, unfortunately, for a lot of us in leadership. So we have to make, concerted drive in that area. Some of that is the platform. Some of that is also a focus on students, which we've tried to do more with the, trying to make our membership dues for students to be much more in line with what makes sense for a student, and then also to give opportunities for students. So for example, the journal, we do want to have a focus on student driven research as a way to help them in their own career. And then one of the things that I think that, and I personally would like to be involved with this when I turn the reins over, is a young professionals program where we can focus on that demographic. And it's not necessarily age, right? Because it's also that stage in their career, again, to help mentor them and get them prepared to sort of take over leadership positions later on.
Yeah, 100% on all of that, for sure. And so we have currently, as we speak, there is a community of interest forming at the Naval Postgraduate School, which is a relatively younger demographic, typically military officers in their late 20s, maybe early 30s, which is fantastic. And I'm thinking even younger than that, so, college students or maybe even high school students, and figuring out programs to engage with those cohorts, so that they're aware, number one, that you are being influenced, and not all of that influence is positive. And it's start there, so that our society in general is more aware of what is bearing down on us. next topic can be, taken in a unproductive direction, but I mean this in the most beneficial manifestation of civil military fusion or civil military collaboration. What are your thoughts there?
Well, this is, I mean, it's interesting to call it out because in my mind, you can't like these stovepipes when it comes to operating in the information environment. The stovepipes are what hurt us the most. And some of that is because organizations, they have to fight over resources. So you have DoD programs, you have State Department programs, they have different responsibilities. Commercial or private sector entities are completely different. But we're only going to be effective if we can find better ways to bring those together than we have now. And I mean, all you have to do is look at what our adversaries do in this space. We try to live by a set of rules and norms that draw these distinctions that our adversaries don't follow. And I don't think it's a matter, I mean, we don't want to break the rules, but we also have to understand where those rules and norms need to be evolved in order to deal with these challenges. And I think this is one space where we have been especially slow in that evolution to be able to keep up with what our adversaries are doing.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, there are these excruciating trade-offs which are really hard to grapple with, but major project to actually grapple with it and to chart a productive path forward through these challenges. Next big topic, academia.
Well, as I mentioned before, none of this, we need that the academic underpinnings, just like in any community, you can have a community of practice, but if it's not informed by the evolving research, and it's in our mission to not just bring together communities, but to bring together different disciplines, because I think that's part of the real value from an information perspective, is not just to think about the ones and zeros. Like thinking about this as if I think about malign influence in the information environment as a signal processing problem, that if I just remove the noise, then everything will be okay, it misses the fact that at some point that has to go into somebody's head. And so I can filter out the noise, what I think is the noise, but am I effective at that? And even then, are the individuals who are getting what's left over actually interpreting that information the right way? We need, to a large extent, the academic community to be thinking about these problems and trying to do the deep research to help us understand. Otherwise, this will just continue to be more art than science, and we'll be guessing our way in a path forward, not trying to plot an actual logical path.
Yeah, good perspective there. What about your comments on bleeding edge tech and tech incubation, and or interfacing with Silicon Valley and other tech hubs?
Yeah, I mean, I am, because part of my day job is actually looking at science and technology. I don't mean to be as pessimistic as what I said at the beginning. Technology is very important in this space. I just, there's always, sometimes I tell people, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing, right? Sometimes we go to extremes. Technology is important. Sometimes we overemphasize that, or we overemphasize the people part of it. It's about finding a balance, and being able to engage with that tech community is part of that balance, because there are tons of technologies, there are tons of bright thinkers with ideas for how to take the technology and put it in an operational environment that we need access to. And oh, by the way, because so much of what we need influence is not DoD and government, it's the public, and that's much better coming from the commercial sector than looking as if it is a DoD imposed or a government imposed solution on the public. And so I think that whole, like, again, that interaction between all of those elements that you talked about before is extremely important.
Right. Next topic, fundraising.
I think you mean fundraising just from an IPA perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as an organization, there's only so much we can do. I think when I talk about that growth earlier and the institutional stability, a lot of that is coming from the sponsorships and the fundraising that we're able to do, because no matter how many dedicated people that we have, which from both the board and the membership perspective, we have people willing to give the time, but to some degree, you need those resources. There's a lot of stuff that we could do so much more if we had more resources, because we have done a lot of what we've done so far basically on a shoestring and the goodwill of people being able to volunteer, and that's great, but that hits a limit, and that's where our ability to get out. One of the things as an organization that we're in the process of doing is moving from a 501c6 organization, which is an industry association, to a 501c3. Both are nonprofits, but obviously the 501c3 allows us to take in certain gifts and certainly donations, and makes those donations tax deductible. And so that's a big goal to have done by the end of the year, is to try to get that status, because again, that unlocks, as an organization, unlocks a lot of doors for us.
Right. Is there anything that we haven't covered that comes to mind for you? Like, one thing that I don't recall if you mentioned this or not, but we've been working on a professional credentialing program that is, still needing some TLC in order to get operationalized. But could you talk a little bit about the professional certificate and why that it would be a good thing for the community?
Well, it's the P in the title, right? I mean, professionals. Part of what we're trying to do as an organization is build that credibility, to build a community and a cohesive community, right? Because we do draw people from a bunch of different disciplines and a bunch of different professional backgrounds, and trying to find a way to bring all of those together. And I think that's what we see the certification giving us, right? It gives some it puts some arms around the people who consider themselves information professionals, and it also it creates another incentive. So talking about the next generation professionals, I mean, we've been in this community for a long time. It's helpful, but not so helpful as it is for that next generation, and to help give them some credibility as they move into this space. And I think it's part of that mentoring process to make that available. But as you said, there's still quite a bit of work to try to get that to a level of maturity. I mean, we want there to be rigor. We want it to be broadly accepted, not just in the government, but in the private sector. And part of that is convening people and having this discussion like we're having, to make sure that we're on the right path.
Yeah, well, thanks for all that, Kevin. So back to our audience, again, there's a link in the show notes for you to go and find out additional information about this position and how to apply. Please share it with your networks. We are as Kevin was saying, we are very interested in casting a very wide net here to collect a whole bunch of applications from a variety of people, not necessarily just within the national security community, but the commercial sector is doing some exquisite work in this area, and those leaders definitely have something to contribute. So please, if you have any energy around this kind of a problem set, please consider applying. And so, Kevin, we have a couple of typical wrap-up questions. So in Cognitive Crucible tradition, I will go ahead and ask you these as well. So do you have a fruitful research question that you might suggest to an interested student?
So, obviously think about this a lot. Unfortunately, knowing that the topics are way more than I have the capacity to do, I have spent some time thinking about, some of these questions. One that really stands out in my mind, and it's on this idea of strategic culture, which is really mostly seen through a political science lens. But the more I think about it, because if you think about strategic culture as it affects our approach for operating in the information environment, we in the US have a very specific approach for how we organize and approach these problems. And you can look back in history and see commonality, whether that be World War I, World War II, Vietnam, up until now. There's a lot of commonality for how we've done that. But major variation, obviously there's going to be variation with countries like China and Russia, but even closer allies. The Brits have a slightly different approach because their strategic context is different, but also culturally how they approach some of these challenges like privacy and civil liberties as a function of operating in the information environment. So I would love to see someone look at, but in a multidisciplinary way, because there are sociological, anthropological, there are political science obviously fits into it, multi factors that get into this. But I also think because we don't tend to think of a US strategic culture, we downgrade or denigrate that as a function. I think there's more to it, but again, that's a hypothesis, and I've never really had the opportunity other than through my own reading. But I feel like there is a research question there.
Yeah, that is a cool topic to investigate, and not to make this about me, but I've thought about this just a little bit as well, and we've got a really interesting episode that will be coming out a couple of weeks after this episode, so stay on the lookout for it. But it's with a gentleman named Dr. Z. But he talks about in his episode the concept of a rhizome. And a rhizome in biology, or maybe chemistry, or both, a rhizome is the network of roots underneath a plant. So a plant has like a root ball, right? And the rhizome is that ecosystem that is contained within the roots of a plant. And every plant has a different rhizome, and it's like its culture, right? And so I love these connections between like nature and human studies. So but the culture that we live in is unique to us. It's unique to our time. It's ever evolving, and other cultures, China, Russia, every country, every family for that matter has its own culture. And so yeah, studying that strategic culture is a really interesting topic. And another way that I've thought about looking at this problem is by using like Jungian archetypes, and asking the question, what archetypes inhabit different cultures at different times, right? And there's probably like a dozen or maybe 20 or so like well-known archetypes, and it would be kind of an interesting overlay into your strategic culture project to try to tease out, what archetypes are inhabiting these spaces, and how do the archetypes describe or embody, or how does the society embody different archetypes and the way those archetypes tend to manifest themselves? That was a big sidebar, but do you have any like follow-up thoughts on what I was just saying? I'm curious.
Well, I mean, that's exactly the type of thing. I mean, it's funny because I've heard you talk about the archetypes, and because there's a psychological side to it. The other part is the archetypes we think we are versus the archetypes that sort of history sort of shows. Because I think, again, some part of this is what we perceive ourselves to be, and a more objective view of what that is. Because I do think that that's part of the challenge that we deal with strategically, is we have this view of the US that is sometimes hard for us. It's hard for us to be critical of, but I think it's also, it's sort of like, it's hard for you to see objectively what you're steeped in, unless, the people who can do that are the people who've spent a lot of time overseas, right? Because then they come back, they've been out of it long enough, they see those differences. So the sort of extra angle to that is the archetypes we think we are, and then someone with a more objective view of what those actual, and then looking at what those differences are.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, and last question: do you have a book or other online resource that an interested listener might check out that could be related to this kind of stuff, or it could just be interesting materials that are loosely related to the Information Professionals Association?
So this is the question I've most been looking forward to answering.
All right, love it.
John knows this, but I am a book person, so I have plenty of recommendations. One of the things that I have always done, there are tons of great books about the now, and I've sort of alluded to this as we talked earlier, but I'm a big fan of sort of looking historically and really trying to understand the roots of we are here because we have centuries and millennia of history behind us, and I'm trying to understand that better. And so this is actually one of the things I would like to do as we go forward, is to try to capture some of the like key historical works in the operating in the information environment space, so that people understand that. Because a lot of times, if it's published 50 years ago, a lot of these things aren't even widely available. So I'm gonna mention a couple, and then I have one podcast I want to mention. So one is a book, it's from the what is now the National Defense University. It's called Global Psychological Conflict, and the book I have is dated from 1963. I thought it was interesting, partly from the title, right? Global Psychological Conflict. It's not psychological warfare. It's not information operations, but it completely captures that, what was happening at that point. And I think it really gets to this point, the one of the things that I was hoping to make the point of earlier, that what we're trying to get at is very different. The approach that we've had sort of in peacetime for the last couple of years is very different when we had that ideological conflict with the Soviet Union, with communism. And even just the title, but it also it describes a lot of what the structure both in the US and in Russia looked like at that time. And if you read it open-minded enough, a lot of the things are really not that different. And even the approaches that we take are not that different, even though some of the means are. Another book that I am a big fan of, incredibly hard to find, but it's a psychological warfare case book from 1958. I mean, this is one of the first books that really like collected the lessons from World War II and Korea in one place. And it was developed for the Army, literally to be the playbook for this, right? And again, there's a lot of details. part of what's interesting from that is you pick up some of the things that have really been lost in this community since really the end of the Cold War. I mean, this is one of those places where we had a lot of capability for a long time. When the Cold War went away, a lot of that atrophied, and and to some degree we've been trying to rebuild that. And yes, it evolves over time, but we lost a lot of core capability in that time that we're having to go back and relearn. The last one that I personally think is really interesting is it's a book called Cooperation and Competition Among Primitive Peoples. It was edited by Margaret Mead, who's a famous anthropologist, and it's from a conference that was done in the 30s. The book is dated 1937. What I thought was interesting about this, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, this idea of learning from other disciplines to help inform where we are. So one of the things in some of the upfront material, they sort of categorize people or tribes in this case in different manners, and it's sort of the spectrum of cooperative and competitive. And when you read the sort of descriptions, and you sort of apply it at a nation state, you could start to wonder, like, where does the US fit on this? Where does China fit on this? Where does, Iran fit on this? And it starts to, and because each of those different types have different approaches to the problem, the more you dig into it, you can start to say, yeah, and some of this gets to our approach, right? Because we try to do sort of a one size fits all without thinking about some of these. They're not psychological in this case. I mean, they're more cultural aspects. And it's one of the places where I feel like from a US perspective, we really have a lot of challenges, is the understanding the cultural.
Mm-hmm.
The last thing I got to put in a plug for this one podcast that, and I've recommended this to John in the past, and it's going to sound a little oddball, so I hope people will hear me out, but it's a podcast called Cocaine and Rhinestones, and it's focused on the history of country music. And the guy who does the show, Tyler Mahan Coe, he spends a lot of time myth busting, what people think they know about their country music legends and what they think about these well-known stories behind some of these songs, some of the songs that they highlight. And one thing, that I thought about when I was listening to this show that I think stands out, and I mentioned this earlier too, we have a certain view of our nationalist and patriotic, like how we feel about certain aspects of that. And it occurred to me that the sort of the next hardest thing for people to really look at critically is their favorite sports teams and their heroes, right? And
yeah.
And so, and he does a great job of sort of breaking this down, but also showing that how some of these people, they were very active in shaping their image, usually to hide flaws that they thought would not make them particularly popular, but also how the industry was also a contributing factor that supports the image, including things like, how they spread around publishing rights and contracts as a way to use those as tools for shaping the environment. And I think there's a lot of lessons there that we could draw out. And honestly, it's just, I took away a lot from that, in addition to a lot of good music. But I recommend people, if they want to, actually listen to the second season of that, because I thought there was a lot that actually translates to this community.
Yeah, yes. So Kevin, you recommended this podcast to me. I'm an avid podcast listener, and I too love this podcast series. So I think that there's been 2 seasons, and he is planning a third season, which should be imminent, I think. Pretty soon here. And oh yeah, by the way, this fella Tyler Mahan Coe, for those of you keeping score at home, his father is David Allan Coe, the famous outlaw brand country music star of the 70s and early 80s. He's still
So
alive, but he's not contributing as he once did. But in the second season, um, what I recall as being noteworthy was this kind of like a revisionist history kind of like remaking public image type stuff, especially with Tammy Wynette and her private life compared to her public persona, and her basically manufacturing her public persona through according to Tyler Mahan Coe, according to his stories, it was just complete bunk. The stuff that she was putting out there as far as her public image compared to her private life.
it's really interesting to kind of hear the entire season like tied around these two people. So Tammy Wynette and George Jones. Again,
Yes.
people are probably thinking, what does this have to do with IO? Go out and listen to it, because you're exactly right. Like this idea of, one is how they built their images and tried to maintain that throughout their entire career, and then just the process that he uses to sort of very deliberately, but also in a coordinate, like a rigorous fashion, to actually push back on what people commonly think they know about these people. And I can't say enough about it, but I'll let your other listeners will have to decide whether it's rates as highly as it did with us. So
Right. And just before everybody thinks, my goodness, these two are really going off the reservation here. There really is an interesting touch point, as Kevin was just describing. But bring it back, maybe just to a topic that people would think is more in the bullseye, but also related to what we were just talking about. There's another podcast slash YouTube channel that I'll just go ahead and throw out there as a recommendation. It's called The Propaganda Universe. And the gentleman who puts it on, it comes out as a YouTube video, and also you can subscribe to it as a podcast. But he is going through a very rigorous presentation of what propaganda is. Here's some examples, academically grounded, but it also maps onto what we were just talking about, as far as the way public relations firms can be thought of in some manifestations as propaganda outlets. And just like we were describing with Tammy Wynette and George Jones, it's like they're manufacturing their public persona, and it doesn't always align with their private life. But anyway, we'll have a link to both of those shows, Cocaine and Rhinestones and The Propaganda Universe, in the show notes. And with that, Kevin Gates, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thanks again for inviting me, and to all the listeners out there, including all of our IPA members, and hopefully some future members. Thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting IPA. And I hope we'll see, as a result of this, some people looking to take over my job. But thanks again.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.